Have you ever noticed how, no matter how hard you try to be good, there's always someone who steps on you? At work, when you shoulder everyone's responsibilities and receive only indifference in return. In relationships, when your dedication becomes a tool for manipulation. Or even in your family, when your silence is interpreted as an obligation to endure everything. The truth is harsh. The world doesn't respect those who only try to please. Machiavelli knew this centuries ago. He understood that politics guided by reality, not ideals, reveals a hidden game. Those who are too nice become toys in the hands of those who dominate coldness. The end justifies the means, and the means of living to please sooner or later leads to the end of one's dignity. It is better to be feared than loved, but without ever being hated, because respect is born of firmness, never of submission. This video isn't an invitation to become cruel, but to become dangerous. There's a chasm between being cruel and being strategically respected. And when you learn to use force calculatedly, to build your own loyal armies, to constantly adapt without losing your bearings, you'll realize the power was in your hands all along. The question is, will you continue being nice, or will you finally transform the way the world sees you? The myth of being nice. From an early age, most of us hear phrases like, "Be nice and everyone will like you," or "Kindness begets kindness." It's beautiful. It sounds like a universal truth, but everyday reality insists on belying this idea. People who give too much of themselves end up being the first to shoulder responsibilities that don't belong to them, and ironically, are also the first to be forgotten when they need support. Machiavelli, with his sharp eye, already warned that politics guided by reality, not ideals, reveals the essence of social life. It's not enough to be good, you have to be strategic. When someone lives only to please, without understanding that the end justifies the means in certain circumstances, they become easy prey for those who know how to play the game. The appearance of virtue without firmness is like a sandcastle before the tide. It will inevitably be swept away. Think of that co-worker who accepts everything without complaint. He arrives early, leaves late, writes reports that weren't even his responsibility, covers for others' mistakes, and even apologizes when something goes wrong. At first, he may even receive pats on the back and phrases like, "You're essential here." But in practice, he becomes exploited. Over time, no one respects him, they just use him. This is where Machiavellian philosophy becomes almost surgical. The prince, or in this case, any of us, cannot be guided solely by the desire to be loved. Better to be feared than loved, said Machiavelli, but with the prudence to avoid being hated. The good guy doesn't scare, doesn't impose, doesn't inspire firmness. He lives hostage to other people's approval, unaware that decisions need to be made based on real human nature, not a moralistic fairy tale. And human nature, as we know, is driven by interests, fears, and advantages, never just by kindness. The myth of being nice is sustained by a kind of collective fantasy, the idea that if I always smile, give in, and sacrifice, the world will be grateful and fair to me. But the world doesn't work that way. The invisible power game is present in every environment, be it the office, politics, relationships, or even family. Those who don't understand this become disposable. Machiavelli spoke of the calculated use of force, of virtù and fortuna, of constant adaptability. These concepts don't imply violence or excessive coldness, but intelligence in positioning. Those who learn to set limits, to say no at the right time, to become a little unpredictable, earn more respect than those who spend their lives trying to be agreeable. This is where the chessboard begins to reveal itself. The nice guy is a player who doesn't know the rules, while the strategist knows they don't need to be cruel, but they do need to be dangerous. And this brings us to an essential point. What lies behind the intimate psychology of those who insist on living to please? The psychology of the good guy. Behind the nice guy mask lies a psychological mechanism more complex than it seems. Often, this need to please begins in childhood, when the child realizes they only receive affection, attention, or approval when they obey without question. This pattern crystallizes. To be loved, one must deny oneself. And so the adult carries the belief that respect will come through submission. But as Machiavelli already pointed out, decisions based on real human nature show that human beings don't respect those who bow too low. On the contrary, they instinctively sense that those who don't impose limits are fragile and manipulable. This is why the nice guy, even with good intentions, ends up accumulating frustrations. He believes he's building bridges of affection, but in reality, he's erecting invisible walls of devaluation. The psychology of the nice guy reveals an emotional trap. He confuses acceptance with love, tolerance with respect. He does everything to be loved, but forgets the Machiavellian admonition that it is better to be feared than loved, as long as one avoids being hated. The nice guy doesn't arouse fear, only superficial sympathy, which disappears in the face of any real conflict. Deep down, his identity is shaped by the approval of others, as if he were a puppet tied to invisible strings. And when one lives according to the gaze of others, life ceases to be guided by personal virtue and fortune, and becomes directed by the whims of others. This is dangerous because an individual without clear psychological boundaries not only loses authority, but also loses his own authenticity. If we look at practical life, we realize that the nice guy is everywhere. It's that friend who can never say no to a favor, even when he's swamped. It's the partner who accepts disrespect for fear of being alone. It's the employee who, faced with injustice, prefers to remain silent rather than risk his job. These seemingly innocent attitudes slowly corrode the soul. The nice guy believes he's being strategic, but in reality, he's trapped in a policy guided by ideals, not reality. Machiavelli teaches us that the calculated use of force, applied even in small daily choices, can completely change how others perceive us. Respect isn't born from naive kindness, but from the ability to set clear boundaries. And it's precisely there that we begin to understand what happens when we view this phenomenon through Machiavelli's hard, cold lens. Machiavelli's gaze. When Machiavelli wrote The Prince, he wasn't trying to be sympathetic, nor was he trying to propose a philosophy for the faint of heart. His gaze was clinical, almost surgical. He saw man as he is, not as we would like him to be. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, arises precisely from this perception. He observed rulers being deposed, kingdoms crumbling, and powerful leaders falling because they insisted on believing that kindness and good intentions were enough. For him, there was no room for naivete. The end justifies the means, he said, not as a call for limitless cruelty, but as a recognition that true human nature is driven by self-interest, fear, and convenience. Machiavelli wasn't talking about angels, he was talking about men. And in this stark portrait, he made it clear, whoever wishes to rule or simply survive with dignity in this world must learn to use force judiciously. Imagine a leader who decides to govern solely through kindness. He forgoes discipline, forgives betrayals, is generous with enemies, and ignores danger signs in the hope that everyone will be sympathetic. What happens? He is quickly overthrown, replaced or manipulated by those who don't share his ideals. Machiavelli's perspective was pragmatic. It's not about being cold, but about understanding that virtue and fortuna only favor those prepared to act according to the circumstances. Virtù is not moral virtue, it's the capacity for action. Fortuna is not blind luck, but the wind of opportunity that blows only to those who know how to adjust their sails. This is why Machiavelli insisted, it is better to be feared than loved, because fear generates stability, while love is volatile and conditioned by the interests of the moment. This perspective, often accused of being cynical, is actually liberating. It frees us from the naivety that weakens us and forces us to see the world as it truly works. The prince Machiavelli describes doesn't need to be cruel, but he does need to understand that respect is not the same as pleasing. And this is where the key comes in. One must avoid being hated, but one can never depend solely on love. Love fades at the slightest sign of frustration, but respect based on firmness endures. For anyone living modern life, whether a businessman, a politician, a team leader, or simply someone who wants to be taken seriously, this lens is crucial. And when we apply this perspective to the myth of the good guy, we understand why respect is never born solely from kindness. It is at this point that reality shows its harshest face. Respect is not born from kindness. Respect is not a currency earned by distributing favors or accumulating docile gestures. Those who believe this sooner or later discover the frustration of realizing that boundless kindness inspires not reverence, but rather exploitation. Machiavelli observed that rulers who sought to be loved without arousing fear were betrayed by their own subjects at the first opportunity. It is better to be feared than loved, he warned, because fear builds a foundation of stability, while love is unstable, fickle, and conditioned by circumstances. The calculated use of force, even if it is the psychological strength of saying a firm no, outweighs much more than the desperate attempt to please everyone. Respect is born from clear boundaries, firmness in upholding principles, and constant adaptability in the face of changing scenarios. In everyday life, just observe. The boss who tries to be everyone's friend ends up losing authority because subordinates confuse closeness with permissiveness. The teacher who never corrects students firmly loses control of the classroom because students perceive kindness as weakness. The relationship partner who gives in to everything, believing this will maintain love, ends up being despised. These examples show that decisions based on real human nature, not romantic ideals, are the only ones that sustain lasting respect. And it's curious how the appearance of virtue can even be dangerous. Those who appear too good arouse distrust, because excessive kindness sounds like a mask. Respect arises from consistency between words and actions, not from submission to the whims of others. Machiavelli understood that a ruler, or anyone who wants to be taken seriously, needs to balance virtue and fortune. Virtue to act firmly, fortune to harness favorable winds. But he never depended on being loved, because he knew that collective love fades in the face of crises. It is respect, based on the perception of strength, that ensures loyalty in difficult times. Even on a personal level, those who learn to position themselves clearly, to set limits, and not fear disapproval, notice a drastic change. Suddenly, people begin to listen more, to measure their words, to recognize authority. Respect is the result of a solid stance, not a constant smile. And when we understand this, we realize how the invisible game of power is constantly in motion, even when we pretend it doesn't exist. The invisible game of power isn't advertised on billboards, nor revealed in fancy speeches. It operates invisibly, silently, almost subterranean. Machiavelli realized this when observing princes and republics. The true mechanisms were not in gilded palaces, but in secret alliances, in favors exchanged behind the scenes, and in the ability to manipulate perceptions. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, shows that the world is a chessboard where each piece hides intentions, and it is on this board that the good guy always loses, because he plays believing everyone follows the same rules of goodness. While he exudes unlimited trust, Others test boundaries, gauge his strength and discover his weaknesses. The invisible game does not forgive the naive. It demands the calculated use of force, even if it manifests as a simple refusal, a strategic silence, or a look that imposes limits. This game is present in every environment. At work, power reveals itself when someone controls key information but feigns innocence. In the family, it appears when a relative manipulates emotions to maintain privileges. In politics, it is explicit but always shrouded in discourses of virtue. The good guy's mistake is to believe that transparency is enough to be respected. But Machiavelli warned, the appearance of virtue can be more important than the virtue itself, because people don't see intentions, only results. Those who master the invisible game understand the need for constant adaptability, adjusting posture and strategies according to the moment. It's not being false, it's being intelligent. It's recognizing that virtù and fortuna favor those who act cunningly, while those who live attached to ideals become predictable, and predictable is synonymous with manipulable. The invisible game of power manifests itself in even the most banal details. Who speaks softly and makes others lean in to listen? Who sits at the head of the table without asking permission? Who knows how to keep quiet at the right time, letting silence carry more weight than words? These are subtle but powerful strategies, and Machiavelli knew that, in the long run, it is these details that maintain authority. Loyal armies in practical life can be translated as reliable allies, built over time, not with fragile promises. The good guy doesn't see this because he's too busy pleasing others, and that's why he loses. Those who learn to observe the invisible board discover that being dangerous doesn't mean being cruel, but rather being always ready to use power strategically. And here we come to a decisive point. After all, what does it mean to be dangerous without falling into cruelty? To be dangerous, to be cruel, many people confuse the idea of being dangerous with that of being cruel. But the truth is that these concepts follow completely different paths. Being dangerous means conveying the feeling that you cannot be manipulated, that your boundaries are non-negotiable, and that there is strength behind your choices. It is the practical application of the calculated use of force that Machiavelli so championed. Cruelty, on the other hand, arises from excess, from gratuitous violence, from the inability to control oneself. The cruel individual, in the end, ends up being hated, and Machiavelli warned, it is better to be feared than loved, but always avoiding being hated. Dangerousness inspires respect and caution, while cruelty arouses resentment and a desire for revenge. The difference is subtle to the distracted eye, but glaring to those who understand the invisible game of power. In the professional environment, for example, being dangerous can mean saying no to a task that is clearly not your responsibility, without fear of losing favor. It can mean refusing to participate in gossip and backroom dealings, maintaining your firm stance. It can mean making unpopular decisions because you know they are the only sustainable ones in the long run. None of this is cruelty. It's simply applied virtù, the ability to act with courage and strategy without depending on immediate approval. Cruelty, on the other hand, is revealed when someone humiliates subordinates in public, punishes disproportionately, or uses force to show off. The cruel person confuses fear with respect. The dangerous person understands that respect arises from the balance between firmness and justice. Therefore, decisions based on real human nature always point to the dangerous person survives, the cruel person destroys themselves. Being dangerous is, at its core, about building a silent reputation. It's the colleague everyone thinks twice before cheating because they know they won't let it slide. It's the partner who, in a relationship, sets clear boundaries without raising their voice. It's the leader who doesn't need to threaten, but whose mere presence already imposes discipline. This kind of energy, which Machiavelli would call virtù, isn't displayed in fiery speeches, but rather in consistent gestures. The cruel shout to be noticed, the dangerous remain silent and yet dominate the environment. This is the difference between becoming hated and becoming respected. And when someone understands this distinction, they realize the high price of living solely to please. Because living to please, sooner or later, exacts a merciless toll. The consequences of living to please. Living to please is like signing a silent contract of self-denial. At first it may seem light, even rewarding. Others smile, thank you, and praise your kindness. But little by little, this currency loses value. The person who lives to please realizes that it's never enough, that they always demand more, that their generosity becomes an obligation rather than a choice. Machiavelli had already warned, decisions based on true human nature show that human beings don't respect those who constantly give in. On the contrary, the more you give without resistance, the more others test your limits. The end justifies the means, and in this case, the means to please results in the end becoming irrelevant. The nice guy becomes a tool of convenience, used when useful, discarded when he no longer serves. The emotional consequences are even more devastating. The person begins to feel a growing emptiness, as if they've erased their own identity in exchange for the approval of others. Such relationships become asymmetrical. One side gives, the other demands. This is when feelings of resentment, fatigue, and devaluation arise. Those who constantly please others believe they're buying love, but in practice, they're merely renting an illusion. And as Machiavelli would say, it's better to be feared than loved, because conditioned love dissolves at the slightest sign of frustration. Those who seek to be loved at any cost inevitably end up hating themselves. The nice guy psychology, which seemed like a virtue, reveals itself to be a burden. The appearance of virtue, lacking firmness, becomes weakness, and weakness in the invisible game of power is costly. In practical terms, living to please others has tangible consequences. Lower salaries because you never negotiate, work overload because you never say no, abusive relationships because you confuse love with tolerance. Even opportunities disappear because those who only please others don't inspire confidence to lead, innovate, or command. Machiavelli spoke of the need for loyal armies. In everyday life, this means building genuine respect, not cheap favors. Constant adaptability isn't about molding yourself to others' desires, but knowing when to toughen up and when to strategically yield. The nice guy, for not understanding this, pays with his own self-esteem, and before he realizes it, he's already trapped in a prison without bars, sustained by the fear of displeasing. But there is a way out, and it involves a balance between ethics and strategy. The balance between ethics and strategy. Many people, upon hearing Machiavelli's teachings, think he advocated the absence of ethics. But this is a misinterpretation. What he really proposed was a policy guided by reality, not by naive ideals. In other words, it's not enough to be ethical in the moralistic sense. One must be strategic. True balance arises when ethics are not used as a mask to please, but as a principle allied with practical intelligence. The end justifies the means, he said, but this isn't an authorization for gratuitous brutality. It's simply the recognition that often tough decisions must be made to ensure greater results. And in personal life, this balance means knowing when to say yes without losing one's soul, and when to say no, even if it hurts. The world respects those who combine virtù and fortuna, the courage to act firmly and the ability to seize opportunities that arise. But to achieve this, one must understand true human nature. And here's the key: being ethical is not about being nice. Ethics, in the mature view, is maintaining integrity while adapting to circumstances. For example, in the workplace, You can refuse to participate in a dishonest scheme. That's ethics. But you can also refuse to work 14 hours without recognition. That's strategy. There's no contradiction. The nice guy's mistake is thinking that ethics means constant sacrifice. Machiavellian teachings show that ethics and strategy must go hand in hand, because only ethics without firmness is weakness, and only strategy without ethics is cruelty. When someone finds this balance, their posture changes. They become seen as trustworthy, but also as someone not to be underestimated. This is respected by allies and adversaries alike. Machiavelli spoke of the importance of avoiding hatred, and herein lies the secret. Ethics prevent hatred, strategy ensures respect. In everyday life, this balance can translate into simple practices, such as negotiating a raise firmly without disrespect, ending an abusive relationship without aggression, or even leading a team by imposing discipline but with clarity of purpose. This is the point at which the individual stops being nice and becomes fair, firm, and strategic. And it is at this precise moment that Machiavelli's practical lessons begin to take shape in everyday life. Practical lessons from Machiavelli. Machiavelli's ideas weren't meant to gather dust in political philosophy books. They are manuals for survival and advancement, applicable even today. He spoke of the calculated use of force, and in the modern world, this means learning to negotiate, set boundaries, and make decisions even when unpleasant. For example, when entering a work meeting, don't be the last one to speak just to please, but choose your words to make your presence felt. If you're in a relationship, learn to say no when you feel your dignity is at stake. These are simple but powerful actions because they convey the message that you are not manipulable. Better to be feared than loved, but feared here means being respected enough not to be used as a ladder for others. Another powerful lesson is the appearance of virtue. Machiavelli knew that people don't see intentions, they only see behaviors. So take care of your image, your reputation, and how others perceive you. You don't need to be perfect, but you do need to appear firm, reliable, and strategic. This applies to everything, from how you position yourself on social media to how you present yourself at work. Decisions based on real human nature show that most people judge by surface level. And if your appearance conveys insecurity, you'll be treated as fragile. If you convey firmness, even without saying a word, you'll earn respect. This isn't a call for deceit, but for social intelligence. It's about constantly adapting without betraying your own essence. And then there's the principle of loyal, self-made armies. In the past, this meant trustworthy soldiers. Today, it means building a network of true allies, people who respect your strength, not just your kindness. Invest in solid friendships, strategic partners, and mentors who elevate your vision. This prevents you from relying solely on fortune, on fickle luck. Remember, virtue is acting with courage. Fortune is the wind that blows, but only those prepared to row reap results. Machiavelli's practical lessons are invitations to action, setting limits, caring for one's image, choosing allies, and using force judiciously. And it's when we begin to apply this in life that something even more profound emerges. Inner transformation, where we stop being prisoners of others' approval and become masters of ourselves. The inner transformation. Ultimately, this entire path leads to a crucial point, inner transformation. Because it's no use simply applying Machiavelli's lessons as if they were manipulative tricks. You need to let them reshape the way you see yourself and the world. Politics guided by reality, not ideals, is not just about governing others, but about governing yourself. It is in this process that the individual learns that respect is not born from blind kindness, but from firmness. That the end justifies the means when the means is to protect one's integrity. That it is better to be feared than loved. if love costs one's dignity. This change is not external, it is internal. It is the moment when you stop living to please and begin to live to exist fully, consciously, with virtue. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's like a silent battle against years of conditioning that taught pleasing was synonymous with value. It's facing the fear of displeasing, the guilt of saying no, the discomfort of setting limits. But in going through this process, something powerful happens. Self-esteem is no longer outsourced. The individual discovers a freedom that cannot be bought, the freedom of not depending on the approval of others to feel worthy. Machiavelli, when speaking of virtù and fortuna, already indicated that those who master themselves are better prepared to seize any opportunity. And herein lies the secret. The calculated use of force is not only against others, but against one's own internal weaknesses that insist on sabotaging oneself. True inner transformation is becoming someone who can be kind, but doesn't have to be nice. Who knows when to yield by choice, not fear. Who understands that ethics and strategy are not opposites, but allies. Who has their own loyal armies, people, principles, and inner limits that sustain them. At this point, the invisible game of power ceases to be threatening and becomes a board on which you know how to move the pieces intelligently. This change is symbolic. It is the rebirth of someone who has ceased to be a puppet and become a protagonist. And this is where the journey ends and another begins, because the question that remains is, are you ready to apply Machiavelli's lessons not only in the external world, but within yourself? So tell me, how long will you accept living to please, believing that kindness alone generates respect? How many times will you remain silent to avoid displeasing, even knowing deep down that it destroys your dignity? Machiavelli had already shown that politics guided by reality, not ideals, is the only path. For those who truly desire respect, the end justifies the means, and your means now must be the courage to change. Start small, set a limit today, say no to something that wears you down. Show that you know how to use force calculatedly without losing ethics, but also without losing your firmness. Discover how powerful it is to carry virtù and seize fortune when you take a stand. Because being dangerous isn't about being cruel. It's simply about never again being held hostage to the approval of others. Now I ask you, are you ready to stop playing nice and earn the respect you've always sought? If so, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here you'll find much more than catchphrases. You'll find the raw truth of power. And perhaps it's precisely this truth that will transform your life from now on.